Bring her here, the Alpha King commanded after seeing the rejected Omega sing while scrubbing floors. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Elena Moore. The stone floors of the Great Hall were colder than the early morning air, the kind of chill that seeped through thin shoes and settled into the bones. And Elena felt it with every slow pass of the brush as she scrubbed along the edges where torchlight barely reached, careful not to look up, careful not to be seen, because being seen had never brought her anything good. Above her, laughter drifted like smoke, easy and careless, the sound of people who belonged here, who wore fine fabric and spoke without lowering their voices, who never had to ask permission to exist in the open. Elena had learned long ago how to make herself small, how to move without sound, how to work until her arms ached and her palms burned without anyone noticing, because she was a rejected Omega and rejection had a way of erasing a person even while they were still breathing. The bucket at her side was half full, the water cloudy with soap and dust, and she shifted it a few inches to the left, measuring her movements by habit, keeping her head down as a pair of polished boots passed within a foot of her shoulder. Someone said her name, not sharply, not kindly either, just enough to remind her that she was there to serve, and she answered softly, her voice barely louder than the scrape of bristles against stone. The hall smelled of warm bread and burning oil and winter air carried in on heavy cloaks. And for a moment, without meaning to, Elena let herself remember a different place, a smaller kitchen, a cracked window, a song her mother used to hum, while the world outside pretended they didn't exist. The memory slipped out of her before she could stop it, a quiet melody threading itself into the space between footsteps and conversation, thin at first, then steadier, her voice low and unassuming, never meant to draw attention, only meant to keep her breathing even. She sang because it helped her keep time, because it reminded her that she was still a person with a name and a history, because the sound belonged to her in a way nothing else did. The brush moved in slow arcs, water rippled, and her song floated just above the floor, soft as dust motes in the torchlight, carrying words about patience and moonlight, and the promise that even the longest night eventually gives way to morning. A laugh cut off mid-sentence somewhere behind her. Then another voice faltered, and Elena felt the shift before she heard the silence. The subtle change in the air when attention turns, when something fragile and unexpected has been noticed. She didn't look up. She never did. Her heart beat a little faster, not with hope, but with instinct, the kind that warned her to finish quickly and move on, to fade back into the corners where she was safest, because in a hall like this, under a roof built for power, even a song could be dangerous. Elena did not notice when the last traces of laughter faded because she had learned not to listen for approval, only for instructions, and so she kept scrubbing until the stone beneath her brush reflected the torchlight in a dull, uneven sheen, her song tapering off naturally as if it had never existed at all. She rinsed the brush carefully, wrung out the cloth with practiced efficiency, and shifted her weight to stand, muscles stiff from hours bent low, when she felt it, a presence that changed the room without a word being spoken. The Great Hall had always been loud in its own way, full of voices layered over one another, but now the quiet carried weight, pressing down gently but unmistakably, the kind of silence that made people straighten their shoulders and check their footing. Elena's first instinct was to step aside, to retreat to the edge of the wall where servants belonged, but something held her in place, not courage, not curiosity, just the sudden awareness that the air itself seemed to be listening. She kept her eyes on the floor, on the faint white marks left by soap, telling herself that none of this concerned her, that she would finish her task and be dismissed as she always was. Somewhere above, a chair shifted, slow and deliberate, the scrape of wood against stone echoing farther than it should have, and Elena felt the sound travel through her chest like a second heartbeat. She had never seen the Alpha King up close, only glimpses from a distance, a tall figure framed by banners and guards, a presence people spoke about in careful tones, but she knew when he moved because everyone else stopped. The torchlight changed, shadows lengthening, and she sensed eyes turning toward her, curious now, measuring, and the old instinct flared again, the one that told her to make herself invisible before attention became something sharper. She lowered her head further, gathering her bucket and cloth, preparing to move, when a voice cut cleanly through the stillness, calm and controlled, carrying easily across the hall without effort. It was not loud, but it did not need to be. The command was simple, unmistakable, and it landed with the certainty of something that would be obeyed without question. Elena froze, her fingers tightening around the handle of the bucket as she realized, slowly, that the words were meant for her. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had misunderstood, if there was someone else nearby who fit the order better, someone worth calling forward. But there was no one else kneeling on the floor with soap on their hands and a song still lingering in the air. A steward approached, respectful but firm, gesturing for her to rise, and Elena's heart began to pound, not with excitement, but with the familiar dread of being singled out. She stood carefully, smoothing her plain dress with a quick, nervous motion, aware of how small she must look in the center of such a vast space, aware of the way people were watching her now, openly, their expressions unreadable. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, the distance between her and the raised platform stretching longer than it should have, and she focused on keeping her breathing steady, on placing one foot after the other, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong. When she stopped, she did not look up right away. She waited, hands folded, posture respectful, prepared for rebuke or dismissal, because that was what a rejected Omega expected. Instead, there was a pause, measured and thoughtful, and in that pause Elena felt something unfamiliar settle over her. Not fear, not hope, but the strange, fragile sense of being truly seen, as if for the first time, the silence in the room was not erasing her, but holding space for her to exist. Elena stood where she had been placed, close enough now to feel the warmth of the torches and the subtle shift of energy that surrounded the Alpha King, and though she kept her gaze lowered, she was acutely aware of him in a way she had never been aware of anyone before, as if the space itself curved slightly in his direction. The silence stretched, not awkward, but deliberate, and in it she became painfully conscious of every small detail, the dampness still clinging to the hem of her dress, the faint ache in her wrists from scrubbing, the echo of her own song still ringing in her ears as something private she had not meant to share. She expected a question framed like an accusation or an order to return to her work, and when neither came immediately, her chest tightened with uncertainty. Then the Alpha King spoke again, his tone measured, neither harsh nor indulgent, asking her name as if it mattered, as if it was not already written somewhere she had never been allowed to see. For a heartbeat, Elena could not remember how to speak. No one of rank ever asked her name directly. It was usually read off a list or shouted across a room with impatience, and the simple courtesy of the question unsettled her more than any reprimand would have. She answered softly but clearly, Elena Moore, and the sound of it seemed to carry farther than she expected, rippling outward through the attentive quiet. The Alpha King repeated it once, testing the weight of it, and she felt something shift inside her at the way he said it, as if the name belonged to a person he was truly addressing, not a task to be managed. He asked how long she had worked in the hall, and she answered honestly, counting the seasons in her head, careful not to embellish or diminish the truth. Around them, the gathered nobles watched with restrained curiosity, some with faint disbelief, others with expressions sharpened by interest they had not anticipated, and Elena resisted the instinct to shrink back under their scrutiny. The Alpha King listened without interrupting, his attention steady, and when she finished speaking, he regarded her for a moment that felt longer than it was, his eyes thoughtful rather than judging. He remarked on her song, not praising it outright, simply stating that it had carried across the hall despite the noise, and asked where she had learned it. Elena hesitated, then spoke of her mother in plain terms, offering no tragic flourish, only the quiet truth that the songs had been a comfort in places where little else was allowed to be. The Alpha King inclined his head slightly at that, an acknowledgement that felt more significant than applause, and he dismissed the steward with a small gesture, ensuring that no one hurried her away or spoke over her. In that moment, Elena realized that the attention fixed on her was no longer careless or mocking but focused, contained by his presence, and the usual edge of humiliation she had come to expect was absent. He told her she could stop working for the remainder of the evening, not as a reward framed for the crowd, but as a matter of fact, and a murmur rippled through the hall, quickly stilled by a single glance from him. Elena nodded, uncertain how to respond beyond gratitude she did not quite know how to express, and as she stepped back at his indication, she felt the strange steadiness of someone who had been acknowledged without being claimed, protected without being possessed. She returned her tools quietly, aware that eyes followed her, but the weight of them no longer pressed her into the floor, and as she moved toward the edge of the hall, she carried with her the undeniable sense that something fundamental had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to alter the direction of the path beneath her feet. Elena left the great hall with her steps measured and quiet, her shoulders still tense from the awareness of being watched, but as the heavy doors closed behind her, the air felt different, lighter in a way she did not yet trust. The corridor beyond was long and lined with stone, lit by fewer torches, and the sounds of the gathering faded into a distant hum as she walked, carrying her bucket and cloth out of habit even though she had been dismissed. Her mind replayed the moments again and again, the sound of her name spoken with calm authority, the absence of ridicule, the simple fact that she had been listened to without being corrected or silenced. It felt unreal, like a fragment of someone else's life brushing against her own. She returned her tools to their place and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the worn wood of the shelf, grounding herself in something familiar. When she finally turned toward the servants' quarters, she noticed the shift immediately, the way conversations paused and resumed in altered tones, the way glances flicked toward her and away again, uncertain now, recalibrating. No one stopped her, but no one dismissed her either, and that in itself was new. Elena kept her head level as she walked, not lifted in pride, not lowered in shame, simply forward, as if testing a posture she had never been allowed to hold. In a small antechamber near the hall, she paused to rinse her hands, watching the water run clear over her skin, the faint redness from work already beginning to fade. She remembered the Alpha King's attention not as a weight, but as a steady presence, the way he had allowed the moment to unfold without rushing it, and she wondered, cautiously, what it meant that he had noticed something so ordinary and treated it as if it mattered. Across the hall, behind doors guarded by quiet sentinels, Caleb Blackthorne remained where he was, the image of the kneeling Omega lingering in his thoughts long after the murmurs of the gathering returned. He had seen countless displays meant to impress him, carefully rehearsed performances and polished charm, but what had caught his attention tonight had been unguarded, a voice offered without expectation, carrying patience rather than ambition. He understood power well enough to recognize its absence, and he understood restraint well enough to know when something rare had revealed itself without asking permission. When the evening drew to a close, he gave instructions in the same calm tone he always used, but his gaze strayed once more toward the space Elena had occupied, now empty, and he committed the details to memory, the name, the song, the quiet steadiness beneath her humility. Back in the servants' quarters, Elena lay awake longer than usual, staring at the low ceiling as the distant sounds of the palace settled into nighttime stillness. She expected the familiar ache of exhaustion to pull her under quickly, but her thoughts refused to quiet, circling around the unanswered questions she did not dare voice aloud. She wondered whether tomorrow would return to its usual rhythm or whether the shift she felt would carry over into the daylight, fragile but persistent. She reminded herself not to hope, not to build castles out of a single moment. But even as she cautioned herself, a small, steady warmth remained, the memory of standing upright and speaking her name without being told to hurry. As sleep finally claimed her, Elena did not dream of crowns or power, only of a long corridor opening into something brighter than she had known before, and though she could not yet see where it led, she sensed that the path ahead had begun to change, not because she had demanded it, but because someone with the authority to reshape the world had chosen, quietly and deliberately, to pay attention. Morning arrived quietly in the palace, the kind of soft gray dawn that slipped through narrow windows and painted the stone corridors with pale light. and Elena woke before the bell, her body trained by years of early hours even when her mind still hovered between sleep and memory. For a moment she lay still, listening to the subtle sounds around her, footsteps in distant halls, the low murmur of guards changing shifts, the faint clink of metal far away, and she wondered if the night before had been real or only a fragment of a dream that would fade once the day began. She rose carefully, smoothing her simple dress, tying her hair back with practiced hands, and stepped into the corridor prepared for everything to return to the way it had always been. Yet as she moved through the servants' wing, she sensed the difference immediately. The way people glanced at her not with open scorn but with curiosity, the way conversations lowered when she passed, not to mock, but to observe. No one spoke her name aloud, but she felt it hovering just beneath the surface, carried quietly from mouth to mouth. When she reached the antechamber near the great hall, a steward she had seen many times before paused and nodded to her, not curtly, not warmly either, simply acknowledging her presence as if it were expected, and that small gesture unsettled her more than outright dismissal ever had. Elena took up her assigned tasks, moving methodically, grounding herself in routine, but she could not ignore the awareness that she was being noticed, measured now against something other than her rank. Later that morning, word spread through the palace with careful restraint that the Alpha King had requested a report on the household assignments, and with it came a ripple of unease among those who managed such things. Changes, even subtle ones, made people nervous, and Elena felt the tension coil in the air as clearly as she felt the weight of the mop in her hands. She was not summoned immediately, and that uncertainty gnawed at her more than a clear order would have. Across the palace, Caleb Blackthorne reviewed the information brought to him with the same calm attention he applied to matters of state, noting patterns others overlooked, recognizing how power settled into habits that went unquestioned for too long. He did not seek disruption for its own sake, but he understood that neglect often hid behind tradition, and the image of Elena kneeling on the stone floor returned to him, steady and uncomplaining, her voice carrying without demand. He asked questions that seemed simple on the surface, clarifications about roles and placements, about who worked where and for how long, and the answers revealed more than their speakers intended. When Elena was finally summoned, it was not with urgency, but with formality, and she followed the steward through familiar corridors with her heart beating faster than she liked, reminding herself to breathe evenly, to listen before reacting. She was brought not to the throne room, but to a smaller chamber adjoining the hall, one used for quiet discussions rather than spectacle, and the choice itself told her more than words could have. Caleb was there, standing near a window, the morning light outlining his profile, and when he turned to her, his expression was composed, attentive, unchanged by the power he carried. He did not accuse or praise, only asked her to speak freely about her work, her hours, her skills beyond what had been assigned to her, and as Elena answered, carefully at first, and then with growing clarity, she realized that this was not an examination meant to trap her, but an invitation to be honest. Outside the chamber, the palace continued its measured rhythm, unaware that within its walls, a quiet recalibration was underway, one that would test assumptions long held and unsettle those who relied on invisibility to maintain their comfort, while Elena stood at the center of it, not demanding change, but present enough now that change could no longer pretend she did not exist. Elena remained in the small chamber longer than she expected, answering questions that felt simple, yet carried unfamiliar weight, describing tasks she had mastered quietly over the years, inventory she kept by memory, small efficiencies learned through necessity rather than instruction, and with each answer she sensed the attention in the room sharpening, not toward her rank, but toward her competence. Caleb listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed but alert, and when she finished, he did not respond immediately, allowing a brief silence to settle, one that felt considered rather than dismissive. He thanked her for her honesty, a phrase spoken plainly, without ceremony, and dismissed her with a nod that carried finality without coldness. Elena left the chamber feeling as though she had stepped through an unseen threshold, uncertain of what lay on the other side, but aware that returning to ignorance would no longer be possible. The rest of the day unfolded with a subtle tension woven through its routines, stewards conferring more frequently than usual, assignments double-checked, whispers exchanged in corners where voices rarely carried before. Elena worked steadily, resisting the urge to read too much into every glance. Yet she could not miss the way certain expectations had begun to shift, how her presence no longer blended seamlessly into the background. By afternoon, a message circulated through the household, precise and measured, announcing adjustments to service rotations and responsibilities, framed as an efficiency initiative under the Alpha King's directive. Names were reassigned, roles clarified, redundancies addressed, and though Elena's name was included only once, the change was unmistakable. Her duties broadened, her position placed closer to the administrative heart of the palace rather than its margins. Some accepted the news with professional composure, others with thinly veiled resentment, and Elena felt the weight of it all settle onto her shoulders, heavier than the mop or bucket had ever been. She reminded herself to remain calm, to do the work asked of her with the same care she always had, understanding that scrutiny now followed every movement. In the late afternoon, she was instructed to deliver a ledger to a receiving room near the main hall, a task simple in description but charged with implication. And as she approached, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves tempered by a growing steadiness she did not yet fully recognize as her own. Inside, Caleb stood with two advisors, their conversation quiet but intense, and as Elena entered, he acknowledged her immediately, not by stopping the discussion, but by inclining his head slightly, a gesture that confirmed her presence without spectacle. She delivered the ledger, explained its contents succinctly, and waited, hands folded, while he reviewed a page with interest. One advisor glanced at her with surprise poorly concealed, the other with calculation, but Caleb's focus remained on the information, not the assumptions that usually accompanied it. He asked a follow-up question, brief and direct, and Elena answered without hesitation, realizing only afterward that her voice had not wavered. When she was dismissed, she felt neither relief nor fear, but a quiet resolve taking shape, the understanding that she was now part of a process larger than herself, one that would not allow her to retreat easily. As evening approached, the palace seemed to hold its breath, the initial adjustments sending ripples through established patterns, and Elena sensed that this was only the beginning, not of sudden transformation, but of deliberate reordering. Somewhere within those stone walls, authority had chosen attention over neglect, and that choice carried consequences that would unfold with time, testing patience and resolve alike. As Elena continued forward, no longer invisible, but not yet fully defined, standing at the center of a quiet turning point. By the third day, the palace had settled into a new rhythm that felt deceptively calm, the kind that followed a change everyone sensed but few understood, and Elena moved through it with growing awareness of how closely her actions were being observed. She carried messages between offices now, handled records that once would have passed over her entirely, and each task completed without error seemed to recalibrate expectations further. Some greeted her with polite neutrality, others with tight smiles that did not reach their eyes, and a few with genuine curiosity, as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman they had overlooked with the attention she now received. Elena responded to all of it, the same way, with steady courtesy and an unspoken resolve to let her work speak louder than speculation. That afternoon, a gathering was announced in the Great Hall, not a celebration, but a formal review of household operations, the kind that drew attendance from those accustomed to being unquestioned. Elena was instructed to be present, not at the edges, but near the central tables where reports were delivered and reviewed, and the instruction alone sent a ripple through the servants' quarters. She entered the hall with measured steps, feeling the familiar vastness of the space, the high ceiling and the stone beneath her feet, but this time she did not lower her gaze. She kept it level, respectful, prepared. When Caleb Blackthorne arrived, the room adjusted instinctively, conversation quieting, posture straightening, and he took his place without ceremony, his presence commanding attention through restraint rather than display. He began the review calmly, addressing inefficiencies and clarifying expectations with the same even tone, and as names were mentioned, Elena felt the air tighten, waiting for something unspoken to surface. It came when an overseer questioned the recent changes, framing concern as tradition, implying that certain roles had always been filled a certain way for a reason that required no explanation. The implication hovered, thinly veiled, and Elena felt it settle on her like a familiar shadow. She remained still, hands folded, refusing the instinct to shrink. Caleb listened, allowed the objection to fully reveal itself, then responded with quiet precision, stating that tradition did not excuse waste or neglect, and that ability was not confined by rank. His gaze moved briefly to Elena, not as a challenge, but as confirmation, and then back to the room. He asked her to speak, not to defend herself, but to present the data she had prepared. The request landed with a collective intake of breath, and Elena stepped forward, her pulse steadying as she focused on the figures, the patterns she knew well. She spoke clearly, outlining discrepancies and improvements in plain language, careful and exact, and as she did, the murmurs died away, replaced by attentive silence. When she finished, Caleb thanked her and addressed the room, stating plainly that competence would be recognized and that disrespect, however subtle, would not be tolerated under his authority. There was no raised voice, no threat, just a declaration delivered with certainty. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. Elena felt it not as triumph, but as a release, the loosening of something long held in place by unspoken permission. As the gathering concluded, people moved differently around her, more cautiously now, some reassessing, others recalculating, and a few meeting her eyes with new respect. When she returned to her duties, she did so without fanfare, but inside, a quiet strength took root, the understanding that she no longer stood alone against assumption. That evening, as the torches were lit and the hall settled into night, Elena passed through the space where she had once scrubbed floors unnoticed, and she paused only briefly, acknowledging the distance traveled not in steps, but in standing, aware that the recognition she had received was not the end of her journey, but a turning point, one that would demand continued steadiness, as the Alpha King's protection, once offered, now stood visible before all. The days that followed unfolded with a careful balance of progress and restraint, and Elena felt herself learning how to exist within a tension without letting it harden her, aware that every step now carried meaning beyond her own intentions. She continued her expanded duties with precision, keeping records aligned, coordinating schedules, smoothing transitions that others resisted, and with each quiet success, the atmosphere around her shifted from scrutiny to reluctant acceptance. Yet beneath the surface, tension lingered, the kind born when long-held hierarchies are gently but firmly questioned. Elena sensed it in the pauses before responses, in the way certain voices softened or sharpened depending on who listened, and she understood that change, even just, rarely arrived without discomfort. One evening, as the palace prepared for a small formal dinner attended by key officials, Elena was assigned to assist in the adjacent receiving room, ensuring documents and arrangements were in place. It was a position of trust, modest but visible, and she approached it with the same calm focus she had learned to cultivate. As guests arrived, she noted patterns the way she always had, who spoke to whom, who deferred, who resisted, and she recorded details efficiently, her presence acknowledged but no longer questioned. When Caleb Blackthorne entered the receiving room briefly to review a final report, their exchange was brief and professional, a nod, a clarification, a shared understanding of the task at hand, and as he turned to leave, he paused just long enough to remark that the process had improved noticeably. The comment was not delivered for an audience, but it carried weight nonetheless, and Elena felt its significance settle quietly within her. Later, as the evening wore on and the palace lights softened, she found herself alone for a moment in the corridor leading back toward the great hall, the space familiar yet transformed by memory. She recalled the cold stone beneath her knees, the brush in her hands, the song she had sung without expectation, and she recognized the distance traveled not as a leap, but as a series of deliberate steps, each one chosen when someone had finally been willing to see her clearly. The realization brought with it a surge of emotion she had long kept carefully contained, not pride, but a profound sense of validation that reached deeper than rank or role. She steadied herself, inhaled, and continued on, determined to remain grounded in the values that had carried her this far. Across the hall, Caleb observed the proceedings with his usual measured attention, noting not only outcomes, but shifts in behavior, the subtle realignment of respect that followed clear leadership. He understood that authority, to endure, must be exercised with consistency and fairness, and in Elena, he saw a reminder of what happened when quiet capability was allowed to surface. He did not romanticize the change underway, aware that resistance would persist, but he also knew that precedent mattered, that a single, visible example could recalibrate an entire system. As the dinner concluded and guests departed, he gave final instructions and allowed the palace to settle into night, confident that the direction set would hold. When Elena completed her tasks and prepared to retire, she paused once more at the edge of the great hall, listening to the echo of footsteps fade, and she allowed herself a small moment of reflection, acknowledging the strength she had discovered not through confrontation, but through endurance and clarity. The path ahead remained uncertain, but she felt equipped to walk it now, supported not by illusion, but by recognition earned and protection grounded in principle. And as she turned away, she carried with her the steady knowledge that she belonged in the space she now occupied, not as an exception, but as proof that true authority, when exercised with care, could indeed change lives. The following morning dawned clear and steady, sunlight filtering through the high windows of the palace and settling gently over the stone floors, and Elena moved through the corridors with a calm that felt earned rather than forced. The routines of the household continued, but they no longer pressed against her as they once had, and she noticed how naturally people now made space for her to pass, how questions were asked rather than assumptions made. She completed her tasks with the same care she always had, aware that what had changed was not her diligence, but the way it was finally acknowledged. Near midday, a formal notice was delivered, concise and official, instructing her to attend a brief assembly in the great hall, and though her pulse quickened, it did not waver. When she entered the hall, the space felt different again, not because of grandeur, but because of attention focused and contained. Those present stood in orderly lines, eyes forward, the atmosphere respectful and quiet, and at the front, Caleb Blackthorne waited, composed and resolute. When he began to speak, his voice carried with calm authority, addressing the household as a whole, reaffirming standards of conduct, accountability, and respect, emphasizing that the strength of the palace lay not only in command, but in the integrity of every role within it. Then he called Elena forward by name, clearly and without embellishment, and as she stepped into the center of the hall, she felt the moment settle around her, not as a test, but as recognition. He spoke of diligence and clarity, of contributions that improved the whole without seeking attention, and he stated plainly that such qualities would be elevated and protected under his rule. The declaration was not dramatic, but it was decisive, and its impact rippled outward, quiet yet unmistakable. Elena accepted the acknowledgement with a steady nod, her posture composed, her gratitude expressed simply, and in that exchange, something lasting was affirmed. The assembly concluded shortly after, but the effect lingered, people dispersing with a renewed awareness of what was expected and what would no longer be tolerated. As Elena returned to her duties, she felt neither triumph nor relief alone, but a grounded sense of purpose, the understanding that her presence now carried responsibility as well as opportunity. Later that afternoon, she found herself once more near the edge of the great hall, pausing where light fell across the floor she had once scrubbed in silence. The memory surfaced gently, not with bitterness, but with clarity, and she acknowledged the path that had brought her here, shaped by patience, honesty, and a single moment of being seen. From across the room, Caleb observed her briefly, noting the quiet confidence in her stance, the absence of fear in her movement, and he recognized that true leadership was reflected not in obedience born of force, but in trust cultivated through fairness. As evening approached and the palace settled into its familiar rhythm, Elena continued on, not defined by what she had endured, but by what she had become, a living reminder that dignity, once recognized, could reshape an entire world without raising its voice. And as the lights dimmed and the hall grew still, the promise of what lay ahead remained, steady and open, a future no longer bound by silence, but guided by respect, and the gentle strength that had finally been allowed to stand in the light.